Hi there, this is Francis Vidgen. I'm CEO here at KnowAtom. Thank you for joining us today on this webinar about asking better questions, which are the key to deeper, more engaged, and more authentic instruction. I'd like to frame this time together around some really key elements of questioning and why we question. And that has to do with thinking, teaching, and learning, and to a large degree how we define those things and what our understanding is about how they occur. So before we get into the agenda and these definitions, I'd like to let you know if you're in the live session that you can ask questions. I'll try to save a little bit of time at the end for questions. This is a kind of weighty topic, so you know, we may run a slight bit over, but if you're in the live session on the right side of the screen, you'll see a little question panel. It's different than the chat panel. And if you could drop the questions in there, and if you can't see any of that, there's a little orange arrow, which you may need to click in order to show that part of the screen. Wonderful. So with that said, let us get started. So the agenda after definitions is really to think about what we mean when we ask students to think, why not all questions deepen understanding, how skillful questioning develops conceptual understanding, and what you can do to ask questions that get students thinking and learning more deeply. And I'm going to approach that from a very practical sense, try to think from the perspective of a teacher planning. So tips, methods, strategies. And to give you a little bit of background on myself, I am a former teacher. I spent about 10 years in the classroom, and a lot of what I'll be sharing with you today is the foundation of what we do here at KnowAtom and have been doing for the last 13 years. But it's also a foundation of how I was able to work with my own students and bring them to be top scoring in the state and in the country. So the first thing I'd like to ask you is what do you expect students to do in their minds when you ask them to think? Let me give you a second. If you have a piece of paper in front of you, just jot a few things down. What do you expect students to do in their minds when you ask them to think? And if you don't have a classroom, think about if you're a principal or an academic dean, curriculum director, when you walk into a classroom and somebody asks their students to think, what do you expect them to do in their minds? Okay, and I want you to just hold on to that for a little bit because what we're going to do is go through a few slides here, get those definitions rolling, and I want you to take this key takeaway, right from the get-go, that we think to develop and deepen understanding. That's its purpose, to solve problems, to answer questions, to form judgments. And I love this quote by David Perkins from his book, Smart Schools: learning is a consequence of thinking. Okay. Now, I want to match that with how we learn to some degree, and thinking about kind of some of the different parts of the brain and how there's no such thing as a fact to the brain, that there are contexts that get stored and that our emotions color how we store and what we think of things and whether we recall it or store it at all. And all of that creativity and analysis happens in our, the front of our brain there, the much more sophisticated part. And the thing is that all these pieces have to work together. So if we try to present facts out of context, what ends up happening is that we're presenting something to the brain that it's not really designed to work with. And then furthermore, lacking context, there's a lot of issues with trying to be creative with those concepts or those ideas, to make decisions, to focus on them. Okay, and I wanted to point out this fact from Dr. Richard Elmore, who's a research professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He said that in his research and the mainstream research, that the typical classroom consists of 70 to 75% of student-teacher interactions that are recall, or memory-based. The reason I'm bringing this up is that this colors both how students are able to learn what we are spending our time thinking about teaching them. But on the flip side, it also says an awful lot about the kind of questions and the type of engagements that we have with these students. So I want you to, again, if you say 70 to 75% of interactions, let's say that all those interactions were question-based. Well, 70-75% of even the questions are recall or memory-based. So that leads us to this sort of question where you say, well, what is a next generation learning environment? And I'm almost through my definitions here. It's an environment for creativity, analysis, and decision-making, a place where students develop control and agency by engaging science and engineering practices with consequences. And this is a direct quote again from Dr. Elmore. And the reason I bring it up is that sort of from that neuroscience standpoint, if we're creating if as teachers we need to create an environment for creativity, analysis, and decision-making, how do our questions play a role? How do we ask better questions, questions that really require creativity, analysis, and decision-making? And in some respects, how is that maybe diametrically opposed to many or the vast majority of interactions that can happen in the typical classroom setting between adults and children? And on the flip side, thinking too that the classroom is a place where students need to develop control and agency. What we mean by that is that they need to be making decisions. They need to be engaged in phenomena and making decisions that help them to understand that they have not only choice, but control of the world around them. And I'm talking in the context of science and engineering today, the examples that I'll use, but this can be generalized across the curriculum. Practices with consequences means executing skill at whatever level, and then having the opportunity to own the result of that effort, to reflect on it, to work with it, to have to use that evidence and reflect on it. When we think of evidence-based reasoning, that's what we're talking about here, okay? So if you execute skill in a situation, maybe your skills are not fully developed, you're going to have control over that situation, whatever level of success or even not success. The opportunity to sort of reflect on what you gather is going to promote that sense of agency. But the real key to it here is that regardless of the outcome, we own it because it's the result of our ideas. So that's what this next generation learning environment is all about. It's not about a classroom where teachers are sorting and straightening students or their ideas, okay? Now, let's bring this back toward questioning. So I want to ask you, back to what you wrote in that piece of paper about thinking, do our expectations for thinking amount to requests for one of these following things? And we could even add to this list if we wanted to. When we ask students a question, are we essentially asking them to, in their minds, connect ideas that we've already presented to them in the order that they were presented, or to follow instructions that we've given, or match a word or fact or concept to a context that we've shown them? Are we asking them to repeat or reconstruct some type of prior demonstration or explanation, or to remember what was said, or to remember the order of things that we presented to them? And the reason I'm asking you this is that back to that 70 to 75% of student-teacher interactions focusing on recall, repeat, procedural type questions or interactions, a lot of folks in the context of Bloom's taxonomy would consider this to be lower order thinking, okay? And we'll get to that in a little bit. But what I want to point out here is that in order to answer any of these questions, if this is what's required, or if this is what we are requesting of our students, we are not requiring or requesting them to think. We're requesting them to recall, okay? So let's dive into this a little deeper, because I want to break each one apart and give a bit of an example. So one of the ways that we see this in emotive instruction, you say, well, what do you mean by connecting ideas in the way they were presented? You hear questions like, what did we say comes first? Okay, what did we talk about? What did we do yesterday? These sort of things. Okay, very common questions. And again, these questions and what I'm kind of pointing to here is not something we want to emulate. It's something we want to get away from. Okay, we're going to move towards, in a few minutes, what we want to emulate. So what do we say comes first as an example of one of these less effective forms of questions. Following instructions, what did I ask you to do after that? What did we say we would do after that? Okay, what should you do after that? Those are all instruction type questions. Again, no value for student learning. Matching a fact, word, or concept to a context that was shown. Here's an example. I stuck a concept in here. Where do we say evaporation occurs? Okay, again, recalling. Okay, repeating or reconstructing a prior demonstration or explanation. Are you doing like I showed you? Is that how we did it earlier? Is that how you saw? Another one would be, what is a, and you can just fill in the blank. What is a water cycle? What is a droplet? What is a cloud? All these sort of things, all recall. Remembering what was said. What did we say that is? Okay. Remembering the order things were presented in. What did I say happens next? What did I do after that? What did I do after this? These are all, again, recall, remembering forms of questions. And so my guess is if you've spent any time in the classroom at all, you've seen an awful lot of these types of questions. And the reason that you see these sort of questions is that they're a product of a traditional model of instruction. And a traditional model of instruction is one where the teacher is seen as a content specialist. And, this is true, K through 12. So regardless of what grade level you're thinking about, teacher is content specialist, and then teachers are judged by their ability to explain things to students. And students are judged by their ability to re-explain or repeat or recall, okay? So in a sense, all of those questions, examples I just gave you, that really were the result of a mode of instruction that was very traditional, okay? They are requiring a student to repeat or recall. And why? Because a teacher wants to understand, in terms of this model, whether the child is proficient. Okay, but here's the issue. There are several. One is that those types of questions, one, don't require any thinking. Therefore, they don't develop any thinking skills. They don't develop a student's ability to answer questions or solve problems. They merely fight the way the brain naturally works, to get facts in and take facts out. Okay. The other unfortunate piece of this, which is implied but not necessarily something that's obvious, is that the teacher stands between the student and the phenomena or the content. And so what happens here is if you take the teacher out of the picture, how is a student able to access, develop, and use that content on their own? Okay, they're kind of in this mode of trying to guess what the teacher has in their mind. So kind of taking this a little further, it's important as we get into questioning further to think what thinking means from a student and a teacher's perspective, or students and adults, okay? I love this quote. Children grow into the intellectual life of those around them. School is no longer about the quick right answer, but about the ongoing mental work, and this is the key, of understanding new ideas and information. So the questions that we ask shouldn't be about quick right answers like the examples I just gave you, but instead about getting students or forcing or requiring students to engage in the mental work or the cognitive load of understanding new ideas and information. And that those new ideas and information can come from the student as well as other students. And that's part of a next generation, certainly science classroom, but really a next generation classroom in general across the curriculum. And look, this is a quote that's from 1978. I mean, this is not necessarily something that's new in the profession, but it's something I think that's often overlooked. So if we continue on here a bit, I just want to make mention what I'm going to talk about here in a moment, especially is work that was done by Ron Richert, Mark Church, and Karen Morrison, and I would highly recommend this book, Making Thinking Visible. One of the key tenets that are discussed here is that what we think about as Bloom's taxonomy really needs to be revised, because it's not about sort of these steps of, you got to get the low order thinking done so you can get to the higher order thinking. It's about different elements that are a part of thinking that help us to develop and deepen understanding. Remember when we started, I mentioned that the purpose of thinking is to develop a deeper understanding, to be able to solve problems and answer questions. So that requires evaluation, creativity, analysis, application, and remembering. But how we ask questions can focus broadly across all of these areas of thinking, or what it can do is to the benefit of the way our brains work, or what can happen is we can view something like remembering as being a gateway, which it's not, to understanding, and sort of fight the way our neurology works and not get the biggest bang for our buck. Okay, so the reason I bring this up is, what is teaching? Well, for the purpose of what we're talking about here, it's about creating an environment for learning, an environment that forces students to think. So when we approach the questioning, that's the purpose. That's why some questions are more valuable than others. And back to that quote, learning is a consequence of thinking. Okay, so if we want to ask questions that result in deep learning, we need to ask questions that engage students in thinking deeply. Okay, what do we mean by thinking? Observing closely and describing what's there. Building explanations and interpretations, reasoning with evidence, making connections, considering different viewpoints and perspectives, capturing the heart or the essence of a situation or a phenomena or interactions and forming conclusions about that, wondering and asking questions, and uncovering the complexity of situations and interactions going below the surface of what's obvious. Okay, so these are called by Ron Richert and his team thinking moves, the 8 thinking moves. And there's certainly more than this. But what you're going to notice here is that there's nothing that is, considered a thinking move that's about remembering what I was told. That sort of repeat recall that all of those questions that I showed you earlier were all about, they have no place in this set of thinking moves. And the reason is because those questions didn't require thinking in order to answer. Okay. Now, our focus on thinking moves is key because from a scientific standpoint, in a science class, we are dealing with 3-dimensional learning. Okay, so the role of students, teachers, and content in a next generation science classroom is a different set of behaviors, values, and expectations. And the 3-dimensional learning operates like this. So the student is developing science and engineering practices as skills, which they attempt and they use to develop and use disciplinary core ideas and cross-cutting concepts. So what's happening here is the student is developing and using the content to answer questions and solve problems. That's why KnowAtom is very focused on not just 3-dimensional learning, but the development of thinking moves, higher order thinking skills, and placing students into the role, equipping teachers and classrooms to step into the role of scientist and engineer on an everyday basis. So the role of teacher is not to stand between the student and the content, but instead to coach skills, increase challenge, engage students in formative assessment. And it changes the dynamic because teachers are valued for their ability and skill at maintaining rigor across all three dimensions. And they're also valued for their ability to question students, challenge their skills, and challenge their thinking. Okay, because remember, these are dynamic kids. Okay, they are building frameworks of understanding and skills, and they are learning how these pieces interact and how to use them in order to solve problems and answer questions. So when you think about the skill of the teacher, they are adjusting that rigor by pushing the challenge further when the student's skill set increases, okay? Removing those scaffolds, okay? Now, from a student perspective, remember we said earlier that students used to be considered proficient when they could give back to a teacher what they were given. Well, in a next generation model of instruction, students are proficient when they can independently perform the expectations of the standards. In next generation science standards, or in adaptive and adoptive states, we call these performance expectations. What this means is that they are in a position of making sense of phenomena, being able to develop and use the three dimensions to isolate elements of that phenomena in order to solve problems and answer questions for themselves. And the nice thing about this model here is that if the teacher is not available, the student is in direct contact with that content, and they have a skill set that they've developed, which is relevant to developing and using the content. And so you can imagine in a next generation testing environment, this model of instruction is much more highly developed and much more relevant to performing. So how do we create a culture of thinking? And I would say that that's by creating a culture of questioning. And there are 5 categories of questions. This is, again, something that Ron and his team were able to develop throughout their research, working with many, many students in classrooms all over the world, I think mainly in Australia. But let's take a look. So the first one here is that repeat recall type question, okay? Who remembers what we did yesterday? That's an example of this type of question. The second type is procedural questions, which direct the work of the class. So this is, what should we, you can imagine someone stopping an entire class, what should we be doing now? What should you be doing next? What should you be doing when you're done? Those are questions that fall into this procedural category. I want you to remember that 70 to 75% of student-teacher interactions are recall and memory-based. So these 2 types of questions are what take up 70 to 75% of the classroom. And the key takeaways I want you to take away from this is that no student thinking is required by these types of questions, that any thinking moves that occur here are basically the result of luck, okay? A lot of times, teachers will see something like a question, I have, well, who remembers what we did yesterday? And they say, well, the kids could answer that by making connections. They're making connections to what we did yesterday and this and that. It's not. That's not what's happening. The kids are remembering what you did yesterday, okay? The problem here is that oftentimes practitioners misidentify the thinking required by these 2 kinds of questions, basically because they view what's happening in sort of an aspirational sense. For example, what I just mentioned, if a student says, oh, yesterday we learned about rain and precipitation. a teacher might look at that and say, oh, that was, a thinking move. The student made a connection between precipitation and rain, or, water cycle or something like that. But that's not truly higher order thinking. That's not truly engaging in a thinking move. And we're going to get into more of what that's about in a second. And unfortunately, because it's not engaging kids in those thinking moves, it's not deepening understanding. And what ultimately these boil down to is guessing what's in the teacher's head. Okay, so I'm going to keep these highlighted in red. But continuing on here, the types of questions that result in true learning are, the first type here is called generative. Okay, questions that require students to explore the topic. So an example of this type of question would be something like, how could climate change reduce the diversity of life on Earth? Okay. Another type of question that we have here is constructive. So constructive questions, and I want to back up 1 second here. So around generative question types, what's important here is that we're exploring the topic, and these are questions that are genuine wonders, okay? They are things that students wonder about. They are things that the teacher wonders about. And what it's doing here is it is initiating exploration of the topic, okay? These are, if I had to draw a picture, generative questions are like sparks, okay? If our minds were like, a bunch of hay that we're trying to light on fire, these are the sparks that we're casting into it, asking the questions that spark thinking, okay? They spark thinking moves. So in this particular case, how could climate change reduce the diversity of life on Earth? Two different ideas that we are trying to generate an exploration around the connection between those two, okay? Not the result of something we've been told, something we need to remember, something we need to be doing, okay? This is not the result of direct instruction. This is a question that is going to generate new ideas, okay? Or generate different ideas and perhaps expose ambiguity, expose bias. I mean, there's a lot of things around why we ask these questions to, get students thinking out among our class, making it visible. The next type of question that's important to focus on here is the constructive form of question. So what that means is building a new understanding of something that we believe we understand. So what does that mean? Well, it means extending it, interpreting, okay, connecting or linking. So why would humans continue to do things that contribute to climate change? Okay, so if you think about this question, what it's asking students to do is to think about the context of people and the context of climate change, and think about the things that people do that cause climate change, and think about humans who know, just like we know, that certain things contribute to climate change. Why would we continue to do those things despite what we know? Okay, so this is taking concepts and basically pushing the links that we have out, okay? Extending or interpreting them, connecting them to new concepts, linking them to new phenomena, to new ideas. And the thing is that it also is helping us to evaluate our learning, because essentially there's sort of two ways to look at something. It's sort of, you can look at something or the absence of something. And so, asking a question like the example I just gave you, what that's going to do is it's going to tell us, here's, how Johnny or Sally understands humans, climate change, the things that contribute. And it also shows me the depth of their science and engineering practices, the skills that they have in order to develop and use those ideas. And furthermore, It shows me their willingness and comfortability and a lot of different things with engaging in risk-taking around making those connections, and whether a student is willing to present their opinion, uh, engage in gathering evidence, and then using that evidence to inform or reform their opinions. And that's one of the keys to these new science standards in the science and engineering practices dimension, is arguing from evidence. So constructive questions around building new understanding, it's something that comes to us through these skill sets, but it's also an element of those cross-cutting concepts because it forces us to take on a new lens, okay, to look at how content and concepts manifest themselves in different ways. And there may be differing opinions depending on somebody's lens. So constructive questions, again, build deeper engagement, deeper learning as a result of thinking, okay, forcing us to think in order to answer. A fifth type of question is called facilitative. Okay, so a facilitative question, what that does is it promotes or uncovers the learner's thinking, okay, their own thinking and their own understanding. So there is some overlap here with, in some respects, there's a little gray area between constructive and facilitative, but basically what we're looking for here is students to elaborate, okay? We're looking for them to clarify or uncover what their thinking is, what their understanding is, and to hear different perspectives, because again, depending the context of these questions, if we're talking about Socratic dialogue or scientific discourse, we have a group think, for lack of a better term, dynamic, as opposed to something that might take place in a formative assessment that's one-on-one or even small group. So the kind of questions that we would see here are things like, can you tell me more? Where do you see that happening? Can you tell me, or sorry, I'm kind of making this up on the fly a little bit, but what would happen if, and essentially what we're doing here is we are putting it back again on the student to build out, in essence, their thinking and their understanding, by shifting the cognitive load. And I think that there's, when I use that term, shifting the cognitive load, these questions, types 3, 4, and 5, these are the types that actually require thinking. Why? Because they shift the cognitive load. Okay, the teacher's not doing the thinking for the student. The teacher's not sort of, planting the Easter eggs and then getting the students to remember where they are and, pop them open and get what the teacher put in there. Instead, what it's doing is it's putting it on the student to exercise agency, to attempt a skill, to own the outcome of that, sort of the consequence of executing their agency, and to use their observations and their thinking in order to make sense of it all, okay? These types of questions, these 3 types of questions, generative, constructive, facilitative, are the kind of questions that result in engagement because what the student has to offer matters. And the students understand that, okay? The students also understand that they have agency. It's respectful of the student. It gives their perspective voice. And you can see how, when we look at that next generation science and engineering practices dimension of the new next generation science standards, things like students have to be able to independently ask questions, define problems, develop models, plan investigations, analyze, interpret data, argue from evidence, construct explanations, and so on. And they even say using their mathematical and computational thinking. These are all cognitive heavy skills. You might say these are cognitive skills. How are they built? How are they developed? Through questioning, by focusing on cognitively heavy questioning, okay? So what are some techniques and some practical approaches that you can use? And I'm going to use science as an example. And I'm going to walk you through a little bit of how I approach this in my classroom or in my classrooms in the past. And if you happen to use KnowAtom as your curriculum, I'm going to use a few tools from the curriculum, and you can use those. You have access to them in order to think about how you might ask better questions and deepen learning through that process. So what I would recommend, first of all, is you have to start by identifying key big ideas for yourself. Okay, so this is sort of like what happens in planning in a KnowAtom context. This is all laid out for you. You have a blank concept map online, and you have one that's filled out at the back of your unit. And what this does is basically, these are big ideas that are a part of this unit, okay? Key concepts. Now, we don't put these out in front of students. Like, a lot of folks misinterpret something like this and say, oh, this is what I need to pre-teach. Nope, because that's going to fight the way our brain works, right? These are not the words that we need to make flashcards out of and then memorize and all that sort of stuff. We need, as teachers, we need to know that these concepts are out there. We also need a reasonable idea of how they are connected, okay? So that's where, in a KnowAtom user's case, go to the back of your unit, you'll see the connections and phrases that connect them. But in a classroom setting, okay, we have to remember that the role of phenomena is context, and that each lesson starts with phenomena, okay? And every unit, so the phenomena within those lessons link together in sort of a larger unit sort of phenomena context. And this picture I'm showing you could be an example of phenomena. So let's use that as an example here, okay? It's an opportunity to engage in something that's real life. This picture is from a real place, okay? It's part of real life. And we can practice agency and control to solve problems and answer questions related to what we see here. Okay, we can engage the thinking moves that I mentioned earlier, just looking at this picture, okay, through some skillful prompting. The next thing that we have to think about is that we have to use questions to force students to actually engage or make those thinking moves as they network the big ideas. So what I have over here is sort of it's a screenshot of a concept map from a KnowAtom unit. And again, this is like, I think this is probably a second grade unit or third grade. It's a pretty, little kid unit. But my point here is that you can see that each of these ideas has a connection, right? These concepts, these big ideas. And the thing is that this is just one connection. Any one of these concepts could have 10 connections to other concepts. So it's important that you understand that you need to expect what I'm calling sub-concepts or unexpected ideas to emerge, okay, in discussion. So if you've got some big ideas identified and there's context, like you have, for example, in KnowAtom, you have context, phenomena, which is going to serve as the context. How do you get the students to make these connections? Well, I'm going to give you some strategy for how to do that. So what we want to do is think about the fact that behind the scenes in any Socratic dialogue or scientific discourse is another way to call that. So Socratic dialogue being a discussion where the facilitator of the discussion or the facilitator of the extension of the discussion is someone who's engaging in questions that require thinking. Those, again, back to those three kinds of questions I was mentioning, the generative, the formative, the constructive, right? In our case, we're using sentence starters to help equip students for that because we want students to be able to facilitate discussion as well. But here's the thing. In that discourse, there are always going to be unexplored concepts. So you can picture that like a black box, okay? So you might ask a question, and what pops up is things like, so I'll try to role play this a little bit here. So you might put this phenomena up and you might say, gee, I wonder why this body of water is so close to those mountains? And a student might pop up and say, well, it has to do with precipitation. And another student might, and you might say, well, can you tell me more about that? And that student might say, well, precipitation is part of the water cycle, and the water cycle is happening here, and another part of the water cycle is not just precipitation, but collection. So that's not even on our map at this point, but we could draw in collection as part of the water cycle. Okay. Now, what we've got out of that is just a few concepts, right? And we could keep pushing that further. But my point here is that another student might say, well, it has to do with storms that happen there, and that's because of air pressure. And you might say, well, why is that? And so what's happening is the students might say something like, well, storms happen there, and I can tell because in the picture I can see snow on the mountains. So you might say, well, how is it that snow on the mountains has anything to do with a lake near the mountains? And then so a student might say something like, well, when the temperature changes, the snow melts. And so what that gives us is liquid water that comes down the mountain and it collects. And you say, well, air pressure, temperature, is that all that's a part of the water cycle? And so kids might get into, no, there are a lot of different kinds of weather. And so what I'm doing here is I'm asking these different forms of questions, the generative, the facilitative, the constructive, at the boundaries of what the students are asking or offering. And when I ask these types of questions at the boundaries of what they're offering, what it does is it pushes their responses and their thinking towards those big ideas which were part of the black box that didn't show up initially. Okay. So what's important about this from a strategic point of view is that I'm not telling the students anything. What I'm doing is I'm asking them questions at the boundaries of what they know, and I'm causing them to generate or to construct or to facilitate their own understanding, but I'm doing that as a skillful teacher, okay? And the thing is that those skills can be taught to students through sentence starters, through concept maps. I mean, the reason that we have blank concept maps in our curriculum is so that students can get familiar with not just the concepts, but actually the connections, because there's many more connections, and there could even be argumentation between these. For example, evaporation and precipitation are related. There's a connection there, okay? Condensation is not on here, but that's a connection as well. And so we could, go on and on about this. And if you haven't caught on to this, what I've done here is just hollow out my black box so that you can see these are the concepts from a teacher perspective. I ask these questions, I'm trying to push students thinking, but other things are going to come up, so we could build it out even further, okay? Now, what happens is as I ask a set of questions, that black box shrinks. And so I'm targeting my questions at new things. So it's like, well, precipitation, okay, tell me, precipitation, are you trying to say that this is a flood? What's the difference between a flood and a collection of water? Students may say, well, a flood is an example of a collection of water, but typically a flood is temporary. And so I might say, well, what do you mean? A pond isn't a collection of water? Is a pond temporary? And I could push them, what do you mean by that? And so that might get us into the discussion of things like floodplains, or I might ask them questions about why we see, ponds like this in some places near mountains, but in other places I can look at mountains or landforms that have no ponds near them. And, maybe there's desert. And so that would get us into weather systems and climate. So all I'm doing is I'm continually asking questions at the border. And so what happens here is that we make that black box, smaller and smaller and smaller, and we can introduce other examples of phenomena. And in the context of the science classroom, ultimately what's happening is that we come to concepts where we don't have evidence or sound reasoning, and that becomes the basis for questions or problems where we would experiment or prototype. Okay, so in this case, we might get into the idea that, engineers solve problems, and there are such things as floodplains, but what happens when we have a problem like flooding happens infrequently and people live in floodplains? How could engineers try to solve that problem? What sort of prototypes, what sort of things might they engage in? What kind of technology, or even from a scientific standpoint, what kind of information would we need to know about a floodplain in order to engineer a solution? And so students could actually work with that thread in order to build it out. And so in this case, you see, this was a shot from a classroom where these little guys were building dams and levees to understand how materials and fluids interact, and how you may engineer a solution to that problem. So in the context of a next generation science classroom, it works like this. There's that anchor phenomena, which we can discuss and sort of pull apart and shrink the black box, right, of concepts. We're going to grow the network of understanding and push that out. But at some level, we're still going to come across things where we are dissatisfied with our depth of understanding or the evidence we have to support what we think we believe, or what we believe what we think we know. And so questions or problems will emerge, which give us an opportunity to investigate, okay? To be able to plan using scientific or engineering process to actually experience some element of that phenomena, and through that investigation, get data. Okay, so we call that sort of an altogether investigative phenomena, which is what those students were engaged in to, better understand that larger context of flooding. And then that allows us to form an evidence-based conclusion about something. Okay, so in this case, these students could form an evidence-based conclusion about how to construct a dam or levee, the things that impact and how water flows, important considerations. And so what can happen then is that they can reflect back on the broader context, okay? So depending on how you look at it, okay, what's happening is the students walk away with evidence to better understand the anchor. And so sort of visually, you're starting with that anchor phenomena, coming to some point where we bump into the limits of what we know about something. We gather evidence to reflect back on that context and actually think about the technology that we would use to try to solve a particular challenge. And we can further reflect on how that technology may impact the environment and other things that have come up along the way. So, and we could almost draw a second arrow where, it goes full circle from the dam back to the environment itself. So the role of questioning, but I guess I would say it's the role of questioning, but more broadly, what is learning? How does learning take place through questioning? And in a next generation science classroom in general, when it comes to experimentation and prototyping, it's about observing something like a particular phenomena like the lake, okay, and forming a hypothesis about how that operates, and then actually experiencing that, okay, by testing the hypothesis, by gathering evidence. And so then what we can do is come to some evidence-based conclusion about how the issues that we identified in the phenomena, or our understanding of the phenomena, best operates, okay, or truly operates in real life. So an example in engineering structures is this kind of Jenga situation where you could look at a structure and say, look at, it's falling apart. I wonder why that is. I believe it's for this reason. Let's attempt that, put that opinion to the test, and as a result, take the evidence, form a conclusion that helps us to reflect back on why that phenomena occurred the way that it did in the very beginning. Okay, so what I'd like to leave you with here, in part, is that true teaching develops learned students, and I like the way that Dr. Elmore puts it, that learning is consciously modifying beliefs, understandings, and actions in the presence of evidence, experience, and reflection. So the way that you use questions to promote engagement, what are the best questions to ask? And if you were to somehow try to rank questions, we need to ask questions that require students to engage in the thinking moves, that require them to construct an opinion or a belief, and then through the ideas of others and evidence gathering, modify those understandings or beliefs as a result of facts and evidence and experience, and engage in deeper reflection, okay? And the reality of it is, and I love this image, that learning, if we are to facilitate that as teachers through questioning, what it does is it facilitates students in classroom environments where ideas crop up, and then they're kind of pruned in a sense, like you see here. You know, the health of our thinking, the health of our understanding is really our ability to develop a framework of understanding based on what we know, which may be next to nothing or nothing. And then as a result of the experience and the evidence, remove the parts, change the parts that are unhelpful, inaccurate, okay, and grow that understanding more deeply. Okay, so I will leave you with that. If you have any questions, feel free to drop those in. There are some case studies available on our site. If you are working with next generation science standards in particular, kindergarten through 8th grade, we do work with districts to make those shifts in professional development, curriculum, and materials. So, feel free to reach out to us. This is a case study from recently last year. We do have more that are coming out, and there's also been a number of press pieces and so on. You can download that for free on our site. And if you have any additional questions or things like that, unfortunately, we are a bit out of time, but I'd welcome you to reach out to me personally. Best way to get me is by email. It's fvigeant@KnowAtom, KNOWATOM.com. And I'd be happy to address any questions there. Again, I'll plug that book, which I get nothing for. Making Thinking Visible, I would highly recommend it in terms of wrapping your mind around what high quality student-teacher interactions are all about cognitively and how to shift the cognitive load. And if you are looking for great science resources that are intended and designed for the next generation science standards in adaptive and adoptive states, we have different versions. Please feel free to check out KnowAtom.com. You can download a sample there, reach out to us. We'd be happy to help you and explain anything that you like. So thank you again for the time, and I wish you luck. I hope that you found this to be useful. And everyone who's engaged in the live session will have an opportunity in about 3 hours to access a recording of this session. So keep an eye on your email. And if you are looking for other webinars, whether it's on next generation science standards, effective teaching and learning, kind of the neuroscience behind how we learn, next generation implementation, curriculum adoption, all these sort of things, you can go to KnowAtom.com, click Learn More, and scroll down the bottom, and we have a extensive resource library that has hundreds of webinars, ebooks, and other helpful supports there, which are all free to access. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time, and good luck in your attempt to ask better questions and deepen student thinking. Bye-bye.